All right, so part 2. It's not my fault. So we left our last the last part of the lecture with this question: is it morally wrong to joyride in my SUV? I know, this is a great movie, and I know this isn't an SUV, but this is the main vision I want you to have of just driving around the streets of Chicago with nowhere to go and only school to skip. So Synod Armstrong admits that he feels as if such individual actions are wrong. Taking a joyride in an SUV would be wrong, but ultimately he offers an argument against this intuition. Right? He begins by asking, why would it be wrong to take a joyride in my SUV? If it is wrong, then this verdict must be grounded in some moral principle. Right? So if it's wrong to joyride, then there has to be some type of moral principle that we can identify that would say, this is clearly why it is morally wrong to joyride in your SUV. And so he starts with the obvious one, and that is going to be called the harm principle. The harm principle says that an action is morally wrong if it causes harm to others. So why is it wrong to swing my arms about over my head? Well, because occasionally those swinging arms will come into contact with another person's face. And so by doing that action, it could create, or it does harm another person. Now, this should be a fairly familiar principle. We've talked about the harm principle before. In essence, it basically expresses the duty of non-maleficence. But when is an action a cause of harm to others? Synod Armstrong's answer, he says, plausibly, when it is either a necessary and or a sufficient condition for that harm. So we are really going into the abstract here, and we're really breaking down this idea of harm principle into its smallest components. Right? So when does an action cause harm? So in the example I just gave of swinging my arms over my head, most of the time this is not causing harm to anybody. So is it morally wrong? Would it be morally wrong to do that when I'm in a crowded, space, knowing that the chance of me causing harm to another person is higher? And so what Synod Armstrong does is he breaks down this harm principle, and he identifies what he calls the necessary condition versus the sufficient condition. So what he says is that if harm is caused either because of necessary or the sufficient condition, then that action would be morally wrong. So let's break this down a little bit more and talk about what the necessary condition and sufficient condition are. So what this means is, take any item, and we'll just label this with the mathematical equation x. X is a necessary condition for y when x must occur for y to occur. In other words, without x, y will not occur. So for example, buying a lottery ticket is a necessary condition for winning the lottery. If you don't buy the lottery ticket, you will not win. So X, buying the lottery ticket, must happen in order for Y to possibly occur. So expressed mathematically, Y only if X. If not X, then not Y. So this is one type of formula that we can think about as being a necessary condition of harm. The second is called the sufficient condition. This says that X is a sufficient condition for Y when the occurrence of X guarantees the occurrence of Y. In other words, whenever X occurs, Y does too. And this is different than necessary condition, right? Just because you buy a lottery doesn't guarantee that you will win the lottery. Just because you buy the ticket doesn't mean you will win. However, jumping into a swimming pool is a sufficient condition for getting wet. By jumping into the pool, you are guaranteeing that you will get wet. So if X, then Y. So I think we've been able to identify here the differences between the necessary and sufficient conditions. Now, notice that unlike the sufficient condition, merely necessary conditions do not guarantee their results, right? I've said this before. I'll say it again here. Buying a lottery ticket does not guarantee that you will win the lottery. It is just that you cannot possibly win the lottery without first having bought the ticket. And merely sufficient conditions, unlike necessary conditions, do not have to occur in order for their results to still occur, right? So, yes, jumping into a swimming pool is a sufficient condition for getting wet, but it is not the only way one could get wet. Right? You do not have to jump into the swimming pool. Running around in the rain or stepping into the shower will also do the trick. So as a view of causation, think about flipping the light switch. So flipping a light switch is both a necessary and a sufficient condition for the light turning on. If I flip it, it goes on. If I do not flip it, it does not go on. So it is both a necessary condition and a sufficient condition. So some actions can be both. Some actions are one, and some actions are other, and some are neither. So let's take this now and bring it back to Synod Armstrong's argument about climate change. Right? Synod Armstrong claims that in order for it to be true that I have caused harm to someone, I must be either a necessary or a sufficient condition for that harm. So I don't think this is too radical, but he's providing us a definition to determine whether or not we as individuals are causing harm through climate change. So if our actions are necessary conditions or sufficient conditions for the harm. But, as he will show, he argues that the person joyriding is neither a necessary or a sufficient condition for harm. So he asks us to consider these two scenarios. He says, I am not a necessary condition for harm. My individual emissions are not required in order for climate change to occur. If I refrained from emitting altogether, that same amount of harm would still occur without my contribution. So, thinking about this in terms of that mathematical equation, y only if x, if not x then y, he says this is not the case for climate change. Now, the second part is the sufficient condition, and he argues that he is not a sufficient condition for that harm either. As he says, his individual emissions do not by themselves guarantee that climate change will occur. If I was the only person producing emissions, the harms of climate change would not occur at all. So, in this case, X, joyriding, does not necessarily equal Y, or does not cause Y. So, let's think, why is this? My emissions go into the atmosphere where they are dispersed and collectively cause harm when combined with everyone else's emissions. But then, my emissions are merely a drop in the bucket. So, for instance, imagine that during a destructive flood, I went outside and added a single droplet of water into the flood water. The flood harms a lot of people, but surely my contribution does not increase the total amount of harm. Rather, my contribution makes really no difference. And he's saying the same is true about our personal emissions. Whether you do it or not, the collective harm is already being done. So whether you add is not increasing the amount of harm. But then, am I not personally a cause of any of the harm that results from climate change? And therefore, I am also not doing anything morally wrong when I produce emissions. In short, I have no moral obligation to do anything about climate change. And that is Senator Armstrong's main argument.